Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature. It's a place of Vancouver writers who just like to have fun with narrative. And tonight what we're going to be doing is we're going to be reading some stories from a book called Weird Tales of the Northern Seas, which is by a Norwegian writer in the 19th century called Jonas Lai. And we're going to read two stories from him this evening. The first story is the Homestead, Westward in the Blue Mountains, which you should see next to me here. And actually, I blibbity blab a little bit. I'll give you a nice picture. I'll even do it in the world-breaking size so you can get a good sense of the detail. The theme tonight is infatuation. Now, it's going to be most pronounced in the first story, which was where I got the first idea for the theme. But in the second story, we sort of see the infatuated character is much less pronounced, but its consequences are much greater, I think. Now, if you're not watching this live, take a look down in the description below, because there will be timestamps where you can jump ahead to the different stories that we're going to read. We're going to read two, the first one being the one most relevant to the title, and the second one also being about infatuation, but about a boatman who, well, he gets a lot of power. Let's put it that way. This first story, though, is about a wayward drummer and the deceitful people he meets. So if either one of those interests you, you can just click on it and it will jump you right ahead to the story you want to hear. I see GS is in the chat. It says, good evening. Good evening, GS. And Holly's House says, I'm here. Well, it's good to see you, Holly's House. I'm glad that you're here. Let me adjust this back to normal size. I hope everyone's doing well tonight. And I hope you all enjoy the stories. There we go. This is the Homestead, Westward in the Blue Mountains. I know, quite the title. From Weird Tales from the Northern Seas by Jonas Lai. There was once a farmer's son who was off to Moon for the annual maneuvers. He was to be the drummer, and his way lay right across the mountains. There he could practice his drumming at ease and beat his tattoos again and again without making folks laugh, or having a parcel of small boys dangling about him like so many midges. Every time he passed the mountain homestead, he beat his rat-a-tat-tat to bring the girls out, and they stood and hung about and gaped after him at all the farmhouses. I mean, there was probably less selection then. It was in the midst of the hottest summer weather. He'd been practicing his drumming from early in the morning till he had grown quite sick and tired of it. And now he was toiling up a steep cliff and had slung his drum over his shoulder and stuck his drumsticks in his bandolier. The sun baked and broiled upon the hills, but in the clefts... Oh. My background just gave up on me. How odd. Let me fix that. Is the magic ruined? I'm not actually in front of a window, in case anybody thought otherwise. Okay. Should be fixed. Apologies for that. The sun baked and broiled upon the hills, but in the clefts there was a coolness as of a rushing, roaring waterfall. The little knolls swarmed with bilberries the whole way along, and he felt he must stoop down and pluck whole handfuls at a time, so that it took a long time to get to the top. Then he came to a hilly slope where the ferns stood high, and there were lots of birch bushes. It was so nice and shady there, he thought, and so he couldn't, for the life of him, help taking a rest. His drum he took off, his jacket he put beneath his head, and his cap over his face, and off he went to sleep. But as he lay dozing there, he dreamt that someone was tickling him under the nose with a straw so that he could get no peace. And the instant he awoke, he fancied he heard laughing and giggling. The sun had by this time begun to cast oblique shadows far down below toward the valleys, laying the warm, steaming vapors, creeping upwards in long, drawn-out gossamer bands and ribands of mist. As he reached behind him for his jacket, he saw a snake, which lay and looked at him with such shrewd, quick eyes. But when he threw a stone at it, it caught its tail in its mouth and trundled away like a wheel. Again there was giggling and sniggering among the bushes. Now he heard it among some birch trees which stood in such a wonderful sunlight, for they were filled with the rain and fine drizzle of a waterfall. The water drops glistened and sparkled so that he couldn't see the trees properly, but it was as though something were moving about in them, and he could have sworn that he caught a glimpse of a fine, bright, slim damsel who was laughing and making fun of him. She peeped at him from beneath her hand because of the sun. Her sleeves were tucked up. And a little while afterwards, a dark blue blouse appeared above the brushwood. He was after it in an instant. He ran and ran till he had half a mind to give up, but then a frock and a bare shoulder gleamed betwixt an opening in the leaves. And off again he pelted as hard as he could, till he began to think that it must have all been his imagination. Then he saw her right in a corner of the green bushes. Her hair had been torn out of its plaits by the speed with which she had flown through the bushes. Still, she stood still, and looked back as if she were terribly frightened. But the lad thought to himself that if she had run away with his drumsticks, she should pay for it. And off they ran again, she in front and he behind. Now and again she turned round and laughed and jibed, and gave a toss and a twist, and so that it looked as if her long wavy hair were writhing and wriggling and twisting like a serpent's tail. At last she turned round at the top of the hill, laughed, and held out his drumsticks towards him. By now he was determined to catch her. He was so near that he made grab after grab at her, and just as he was about to lay hold of her hand by a fence, she was over it. Well, he tumbled after her into the enclosure of a homestead. Then she cried and shouted up the house, "Randy and Brandy and Geary and Guna!" And 4 girls came rushing down over the sward. But the last of them, who had a fine ruddy complexion, always ruddy complexions in these stories, and heavy golden red hair, stood and greeted him so graciously with her downcast eyes, as if she was quite distressed that she should play such wanton pranks with a strange young man. She stood there, abashed and uncertain, poor thing, just like a child who knows not whether it should say something or not. But all the while she sidled up nearer and nearer to him. Then when she was close to him, that her hair almost touched him, she opened her blue eyes wide and looked straight at him. But she had a frightfully sharp look in those eyes of hers. "Rather come with me, and thou shalt have dancing, or art thou tired, my lad?" cried a girl with blue-black hair and a wild dark fire in her eyes. She tripped up and down and clapped her hands. She had white teeth and hot breath, and would have dragged him off with her. "Tie thyself up behind first, Black Geary," giggled the others. And immediately she let the lad go and wobbled and twisted and went backwards so oddly. He couldn't help staring after the black lassie who stood and writhed and twisted so uncomfortably, as if she were concealing something behind her and had, all at once, become so meek. But the fine, bright girl with the slim, slender waist, who had rushed on before him, who seemed to him the loveliest of them all, began to laugh at him again and tease him. Run as he might, he shouldn't catch her. She jibed and jeered. Never should he find his drumsticks again, she said. But then her mood shifted right around, and she flung herself down headlong and began to cry. She had followed his drumming the whole day, she said, and never had she heard any fellow who could beat rat-tat-tat so well. Nor had she ever seen a lad who was so handsome while he was asleep. I kissed thee then, said she, and smiled up at him so sorrowfully. Beware of the serpent's tongue, lest it bite thee, swain. By the way, there's a good chance that a lot of you have no idea what swain is, and it comes up a lot in this story. It is a young lad. 'Tis worst of all when it licks thee first, whispered the bashful one with the golden hair. She would fain have stolen between them so softly. And all at once the swain recollected the snake, which was as slender and supple and quick and sparkling as the girl who lay there on the hillside and wept and made fun at the same time and looked oddly alert and wary. But a stooping, somewhat clumsy little thing now stuck her head quickly in between and smiled shamefacedly at him, as if he knew and could tell him so much. Her eyes sparkled a long way inwards, and across her face there passed a sort of pale golden gleam, as when the last sunbeam slowly draws away from the grassy mountain slope. At my place, said she, thou shalt hear Langelk, and as none else has ever heard, I will play for thee. It's a slow dance, a slow traditional Norwegian dance. Well, music for a slow traditional dance, I should say. And thou shalt listen to things unknown to the others. Thou shalt hear all that sings, and laughs, and cries in the roots of trees, and in the mountains, and in all the things that grow, so that thou wilt never trouble thy head about anything else in the world. Then there was a scornful laugh, and up on a rock he saw a tall, strongly built girl, with a gold band in her hair and a huge wand in her hand. She lifted a long wooden trumpet with such splendid, powerful arms, threw back her neck with such a proud and resolute air, and stood firm and fast as a rock while she blew. And it sounded far and wide through the summer evening and rang back again across the hills. But she, the prettiest and daintiest of them all, who had cast herself on the ground, stuck her fingers in her ears and mimicked her and laughed and jeered. Then she glanced up at him with her blue eyes peeping through her ashen yellow hair and whispered, If thou dost want me, swain, thou must pick me up. She has a strong, firm grip for a gentle maiden, thought he to himself as he raised her from the ground. But thou must catch me first, cried she, and right towards the house they ran, she first and he after her. Suddenly she stopped short, and putting both arms akimbo, looked straight into his eyes. Dost thou like me? She asked. The swain couldn't say no to that. He'd now got hold of her and would have put his arm around her. "'Tis for thee to have a word in the matter, father," she shouted all at once in the direction of the house. "This swain here would fain wed me." And she drew him hastily towards the hut door. There sat a grey-clad old fellow with a cap like a milk can on his head, staring at the livestock on the mountainside. He had a large silver jug in front of him. Pardon me. As we know, old voices gotta wet the throat. "'Tis the Homestead Westward, in the Blue Mountains, that is after, I know," said the old man, nodding his head with a sly look in his eye. "Ha, ha, ha, that's what they're after, is it?" I thought the swain, but aloud said, "'Tis a great offer, I know, but methinks 'tis a little hasty, too. Down your way 'tis the custom to send two go-betweens first of all to arrange matters properly." Now, I realize that some of the articulation in this story can get a little confusing. So here's a quick billboard. There are multiple sisters here. They are trying to persuade him to marry them. Most of them, one of them isn't. They have now pushed him towards their father, or at least an old man, who presumably is their father. He's saying that the reason they want him to marry is because they want this nice property that would come with that marriage. Thou didst send two before thee, and here they be, quoth she smartly. Sorry, that was the old man voice for the lady. And produced his drumsticks. And 'tis usual with us, moreover, to have a look over the property first, though the lass herself have wit enough and to spare, added he. Then she all at once grew so small, there was a nasty green glitter in her eyes. Hast thou not run after me the livelong day, and wooed me right down in the enclosure there, so that my father both heard and saw it all? Cried she. Pretty lasses are wont to be held back a bit, said the swain in a wheedling sort of way. He perceived that he must be a little subtle here. It was not all love in this wooing. Then she seemed to bend her body backwards into a complete curve, and shot forward her head and neck and her eyes sparkled. But the old fellow lifted his stick from his knee, and he stood there again as blithe and sportive as ever. She stretched herself out tall and stiff, with her hands in her silver girdle, and she looked right into his eyes and laughed, and asked him if he was one of those fellows who were afraid of the girls. If he wanted her, he might perchance be run off his legs again, she said. Then she began tripping up and down and curtsying and making fun of him again, but all at once he saw on the sward behind her what looked like the shadow of something that whisked and frisked and writhed around and round and twisted in and out, according as she practiced her wheedling ways upon him. This is a curious, long sort of riband, thought the drummer to himself in his amazement. They were in a great hurry, too, to get him under the yoke. He thought, but they should find that a soldier on his way to the maneuvers is not to be betrothed and married offhand. So he told them bluntly that he had come hither for his drumsticks and not to woo maidens, and he would thank them to let him have his property. But have a look about you a bit first, young man, said the old man, and he pointed with his stick. And all at once the drummer saw large dun cows grazing all along the mountain pastures, and cowbells rang out their merry peals. Buckets and vats of brightest copper shone all about, and never had he seen such shapely and nicely dressed milkmaids. There must needs be great wealth here. Perhaps thou dost think 'tis but a beggarly inheritance I have here in the Blue Mountains, said she, and sitting down on a haycock she began chatting with him. Sorry, a little problem there. But we four such satyr as this, that's just land, like sort of farms in the mountains, if you will. Nice, though. And what I inherit from my mother is 12 times as large. But the drummer had seen what he'd seen, and they were rather too anxious to settle the property upon him, thought he. So he declared that in so serious a matter he must crave a little time for consideration. I just realized I left out an important point. It's important to remember that in places like this, during times like this, I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly certain women could not own property. So in order for them to inherit that property, they would have to be married. Then the lass began to cry and take on, and asked if he meant to fool a poor, innocent, ignorant young thing, and pursue her and drive her out of her very wits. She'd put all her hope and trust in him, she said, and with that she fell a-howling. She sat there quite inconsolable, and rocked herself to and fro with all her hair over her eyes, till at last the drummer began to feel quite sorry for her, and almost angry with himself. She was certainly most simple-minded and confiding. All at once she twisted round and threw herself petulantly down from the haycock. Her eyes spied all about and seemed quite tiny and piercing as she looked up at him and laughed and jested. He started back. It was exactly as if he saw again the snake beneath the birch tree down there when it trundled away. And now he wanted to be off as quickly as possible. He cared no longer about being civil. Then she reared up with a hissing sound. She quite forgot herself. A long tail hung down and whisked about from behind her kirtle. He shouldn't escape her in that way, she shrieked. He should first of all have a taste of public penance and public opinion from parish to parish. And then she called her father. Then the drummer felt a grip on his jacket and was lifted right off his legs. He was chucked into an empty cowhouse, and the door was shut behind him. There he stood, and had nothing to look at but an old billy goat through a crack in the door, who had odd yellow eyes and was very much like the old fellow. And a sunbeam through a little hole, which sunbeam crept higher and higher up the blank stable, wait till late in the evening when it went out altogether. But towards night, a voice outside said softly, "Swain, Swain!" And in the moonlight he saw a shadow cross over the little hole. "The old man is sleeping on the other side of the wall," it sounded. He knew by the voice that it was she, the golden-red one, who had behaved so prettily and had been so bashful the moment he'd come upon the scene. "Thou needst say that thou dost know that Serpent Eye has had a lover before, and they wouldn't be in such a hurry to get her off their hands with a dowry. Thou must know that the homestead westwards in the Blue Mountains is mine, and answer the old man that it was me, Brandy, that thou didst run after all the time. Here comes the old man," she whispered, and whisked away. But a shadow again fell across the little hole in the moonlight, and the duck-necked one stuck her head in and peeped in at him. "Swain, Swain, art thou awake? That Serpent Eye will make thee the laughing-stock of the neighborhood. She's spiteful, and she stings, but the homestead westward in the Blue Mountains is mine. And when I play there, the gates beneath the high mountains fly open, and through them lies the road to the nameless powers of nature. Do but say that 'twas me, Randy, thou wert running after, because she plays so prettily on the langalik. The old man is stirring about by the wall," she beckoned him, and was gone. A little afterwards, nearly every bit of the hole was darkened, and he recognized the black one by her voice. "Swain, Swain, I had to bind up my kirtle today behind," said she, "so we couldn't go dancing the halfling fling," a high energy dance, "together on the green sward. But the homestead in the Blue Mountains is my lawful property. Tell the old man that it was Madcap Geary thou wast running after today, because thou art so madly fond of dancing jigs and hollings." Then she clapped her hands aloud, and straightway was full of fear lest she had wakened the old man, and she was gone. But the lad sat inside there and thought it all over, and looked up at the thin, pale summer moon. And he thought that never in his whole life had he been in such an evil case. From time to time he heard something moving, scraping, and snorting against the wall outside. It was the old fellow who lay there and kept watch over him. "Thou, Swain, thou," said another voice at the peephole. It was she who had planted herself so firmly on the rock, with such sturdy hips and such a masterful voice.
For these 300 years have I been blowing the langele,
the horn,
here in the summer evenings, far and wide. But never has it drawn anyone westward, hither into the Blue Mountains. And let me tell thee that we are all homeless and houseless, and all thou seest here is but glitter and glamour. Many a man has been befooled, hither time out of mind, but I won't have the other lasses married before me. And rather that any of them should get thee, I'll free thee from the mountains. Mark me now, when the sun is hot and high, the old man will get frightened and crawl into his corner. Then look to thyself, shove hard against the door of the hayloft, and hasten to get thee over the fence, and thou wilt be rid of us.
The drummer, who was not slow to follow this counsel, crept out the moment the sun began to burn, and cleared the fence with one good bound. In less than no time, he was down in the valley again, and far, far away towards sunrise in the mountains. He heard the sound of her langler. He threw his drum across his shoulder and hied him off to the maneuvers at Mon. But never would he play a rat-a-tat-tat, beat the tattoo before the lasses again, lest he should find himself westward in the Blue Mountains before he was well aware of it. I see that a lot of people picked up on the direction that story was going. Holly's House says, oh, this girl is full crazy. I know the type. GS says, lol, yes, beware. Holly's House says, dude, run for the Blue Hills. You guys picked up on it quicker than I did when I first read it. I was like, well, where are we going with this? Which I guess makes sense. All right. So we have a second story, and it is almost equal length, so I don't want to dally about too much. I, as is usually the case, like the second story more. I gotta remember where it is in the organization of the book. Give me a second. Unfortunately, this book has no table of contents, or at least the version on my computer, so we're going to have to scroll to it the old-fashioned way. I believe it's this, yeah. Holly's House says it doesn't really have a conclusion, though. Why do they want the men? Are they eating them or something? I feel like it's heavily implied that they're a devil creature. Or at least patrons of a devil creature, because there's that sort of strange ontology of the old man being maybe a goat. And of course, at that time, especially in that area, goats were associated with the devil. I don't know if they had associations in paganism that I'm missing, but I do know that this was written at the time when Norway was pretty heavily influenced by, Catholicism and so on. So I kind of feel like the snake, him being a goat, is that he's sort of like a devil, and these are the maidens of the devil that are there to lure people in. Probably, I don't know, but I'm guessing it's kind of a succubus thing. The serpents in the hills, be careful, they'll suck you in and take the life out of you. Because, of course, snakes have this imagery of, swallowing something whole and then preserving it while they slowly consume it over time. And I can see how that would fit with a kind of succubus metaphor. That's my guess. I will say that, most folk tales don't go out of their way to world build much. It's more, here's a dude who had a weird circumstance. Because remember, the conceit of Weird Tales of the Northern Sea is that these are weird tales from people who are around the northern seas. So presumably, this is a tale that was told by someone who came in and talked about how these scary women trapped him and he had to run away. Holly's house says mountain sirens. Yeah, that's maybe part of it as well, because there's the horn, right? Though it doesn't seem to be very effective, according to her, but the purpose of it seems to be to draw people in. It is interesting that no one really does a good thing. Even though the horn girl is portrayed in a more noble fashion, she still only lets him go because he has no interest in her and or hold over her. Or she has no hold over him, and she resents the idea that her sisters would get married before her. Holly's house says it's just a moral tale then. Stay on the straight and narrow path. I don't even know if it's moral. I think it's just stay on the path when you're in the mountains, because who the hell knows what's out there, right? I don't know if it's specifically a moral of any figurative nature. It might just be travelers, watch your path. Don't get distracted by the ladies. I see there's a question here that you asked earlier that said, would that count as a bard or is that only singing? He was not a bard, he was a soldier. Maneuvers is a soldier thing. However, drummers, yeah, there were drummer bards. Bards were sort of, I mean, I'm kind of a bard here. If I made a living at it, I would have been counted as an old bard. You know, usually there was musical elements and rhyming and poetry involved, but at its core it was, are you a performer of stories and traditional tales and whatever else, right? Okay. So much for getting right to it. Here is a lovely picture as well. We'll do the big one if it lets me do it, so that people can get a chance to see it before we get into the story. This one's called The Wind Gnome. I guess I should say, whenever I answer a question like that, it's not definitive. I mean, these tales are meant to be kind of abstract and a little broad. So what you get from it is as legitimate as I get. I don't have any special insights on the story. Okay, well, we can't spend much more time then. I will get to the story. So this story I like quite a bit more. It is a story of a powerful person and how that power affects them. This is called The Wind Gnome from Weird Tales from the Northern Seas. There was once a skipper of Dyrvik called Barden. He was so headstrong that there was no doing anything with him. Whatever he set his mind upon, that should be done, he said, and done it always was. If you promised to be at a dance, the girls could safely rely upon his being there, though it blew a tempest and rained cats and dogs. He would come scudding along on a faring. Now, people who've been watching my show for the last 2 months will know that that is a boat. To his father's house through storm and stress. Row upon row of girls would be waiting for him there, and he spanked the floor with every one of them in turn and left their gallants to cool their heels as best they might. What a sentence, by the way. Cock of the walk he always must be. He would go shark fishing, too, and would venture with his fishing gaff into seas where only large vessels were wont to go. If there was anything nobody else dared do, Barden was the man to do it, and absurd and desperate as the venture might be, he always succeeded, so that folks were always talking about him. Now, right out at sea, beyond the skerries, lay a large rock with the lair of wild fowl, whither the merchant who owned it came every year to bring away rich loads of eiderdown. Now, before I continue, let's talk about eiderdown because it matters here. Eiderdown is a down from the eider duck, I think. think it's technically a duck. It's a bird in Norway. And because I had this question in my head and it's not answered in the text of the story, eiderdown, like other downs, is just a thing that when they nest, they leave behind. So wherever they nest in large amounts, you can collect up eiderdown, and eiderdown to this day is a highly desired, very soft, very nice down. A long way down the side of this lofty rock was a cleft. Nobody could tell how far into the rock it went, and was so inaccessible was it there that its owner had said that whoever liked might come and take eiderdown from thence. It became quite a proverb to say when anything couldn't be done, that it was just as impossible as taking eiderdown from the Dyrvig rock. But Barden passed by the rock and peeped up at the cleft, and saw all the hosts of the fowls of the air lighting upon it so many times that he felt he needs must try his hand at it. He lost no time about it. The sun was shining brightly as he set out. He took with him a long piece of rope, which he cast 2 or 3 times around a rocky crag, and lowered himself down till he was right opposite the cleft. There he hung and swung over it backwards and forwards till he got a firm footing, and then he set about collecting eiderdown and stuffing his sacks with it. He went searching about it for so far into the rocky chasm that he saw no more than a gleam of sunlight outside the opening, and he couldn't take 100th part of the eiderdown that was there. It was quite late in the evening before he gave up trying to gather it all, but when he came out again, the stone, which he'd placed on the top of the rope and tied to it, was gone. Another rope hung loosely there and dangled over the side of the rock. The wind blew it in and out and hither and thither. The currents of air sported madly with it, so that it always kept sheer away from the rock, far out over the abyss. There he stood then, and tried again and again to clutch hold of it till the sun lay right down in the sea. When it began to dawn again and the morning breeze rose up from the sea, he all at once heard something right over his head say, "It blows away! It blows away!" He looked up, and there he saw a big woman holding the rope away from the cliffside. Every time he made a grip at it, she wrenched and twisted it right away over the rocky wall, and there was a laughing and a grinning all down the mountainside. "It blows away! It blows away!" And again the rope drove in and out and hither and thither. "You'd better take a spring at once, and not wait till you're all tired," thought he. It was a pretty long leap to take, but he went back a sufficient distance, and then out he sprang. Barden was not the man to fall short of anything, though, and he caught the rope and held it tight, and oddly enough, it seemed now to run up the cliffside of its own accord, just as if someone were hoisting it. But in front of the rocky crag, to which he had fastened the rope, he heard a sobbing and sighing, and something said, "I am the daughter of the Wind Gnome, and now thou hast dominion over me. When the blast blows and winds about thee, 'tis I who long for thee. And here thou hast a rudder which will give thee luck and fair wind whithersoever thou farest. He who is with thee shall thrive, and he who is against thee shall suffer shipwreck and be lost, for 'tis I who am in the windy gusts." Then all at once everything was quite still, but down on the sea below there swept a heavy squall. There stood Barden with the rudder in his hand, and he understood that it was not a thing to be lightly cast away. Homeward he steered with a racing breeze behind him, and he had not sailed far before he met a gallus, which gave him the Bergen price for his eiderdown. Now, just a moment. Gallus is a boat from this era, 20th or 19th century Norway. Bergen is one of the largest ports in the Norwegian seas. So he gave him a good price, in other words. But Barden was not content with only going thither once. He went just the same as before, and he returned from Dyrvig rock with a pile of sacks of eiderdown on his boat right up to the mast. He bought houses and ships, mightier and mightier he grew, and it was not long before he owned the whole fishing grounds, both northwards and southwards. Those who submitted to him and did as he would have them do increased and prospered and saw good days. But all who stood in his way were wrecked on the sea and perished, for the Wind Gnome was on his side. So things quickly went from good to better with him. What was to him a fair wind was the ruin of all those who were in a way opposed to him. At last he became so rich and mighty that he owned every blessed trading place and fishing statement in all Finnmark, and sent vessels even as far as Spitzbergen. Nobody durst sell fish up north without his leave, and his sloops sailed over to Bergen 18 at a time. He ruled and gave judgment as it seemed best to him, but the magistrates thought that such authority was too much for one man to have, and they began to make inquiries and receive complaints of how he domineered the people. Next, the magistrates sent him a warning. "But the right to rule lies in my rudder," thought Barden to himself. Udder's a very different thing. Then the magistrates summoned him before the tribunal. Barden simply whistled contemptuously. At last matters came to such a pitch that the magistrates sailed forth to seize him in the midst of a howling tempest, and down they went in the Finnmark seas. Then Barden was made chief magistrate, till such time as the king should send up another. But the new man who came had not been very long in office there before it seemed to him as if it was not he, but Barden who held sway. So the same thing happened over again. Barden was summoned in vain before the courts, and the magistrates came forth to seize him and perished at sea. But when the next governor sent up to Finnmark, it was only the keel of the king's ship that came drifting in from the sea. At last nobody would venture thither to certain ruin, and Barden was left alone and ruled over all. Then so mighty was he in all Finnmark that he reigned there like the king himself. Now, he had but one child, and that a daughter. Bull was her name, and she shot up so handsome and comely that her beauty shone like the sun. No bridegroom was good enough for her, unless, perhaps, it was the king's son. Wooers came from far and came in vain. She was to have a dower, they said, as such as no girl in the north had ever had before. One year quite a young officer came up thither with a letter from the king. His garments were stiff with gold and shone and sparkled wherever he went. Barden received him well and helped him to carry out the king's commands. But since the day when he himself was young and got the answer yes from his bride, he had never been so happy as when Bull came to him one day and said that the young officer had wooed her, and she would throw herself into the sea straight away if she couldn't have him. That's one way to bargain. In this way, he argued, his race would always sit in the seat of authority and hold sway when he was gone. Well, the officer, in the course of the summer, was out on circuit. Barden set 100 men to work to build a house for them. It was to shine like a castle and be bright with high walls and large reception rooms and windows in long rooms and furs and cloth of gold, and bright tiles were fetched from the far south. And in the autumn there was such a wedding that the whole land heard and talked about it. But it was not long before Barden began to find that to be a fact which was already a rumor, to wit, that the man who had got his daughter would fain have his own way also. He laid down the law and gave judgment like Barden himself, and he overruled Barden not once nor twice. Then Barden went to Bull and bade her to take her husband to task and look sharp about it. He'd never yet seen the man, said he, who couldn't be set right by his bride in the days when they did nothing but eat honey together. Which is such a fun way of saying honeymoon period. I like that. But Bull said that he had wedded a man who, to her mind, was no less a man than her own father, and it was his office, besides, to uphold the law and jurisdiction of the king. Young folks are easy to talk over, thought Barden. One can do anything with them when one only makes them fancy and they are having their own way. It is wonderful how far one can get if one bides one's time and makes the best of things. Whatever was out of gear, he could very easily put right again when once he got a firm grip of the reins. So he praised everything his son-in-law did and talked big about him so that there was really no end to it. He was glad, he said, that such a wise and stately ruler was there, ready to stand in his shoes against the day when he should grow old. And so he made himself small, and his voice quivered when he spoke, as if he were really a sick and broken-down man. But it didn't escape Bull how he slammed to the doors and struck the stones with his stick till the sparks flew. Next time the court met, Barden was taxed to a full 1/10 of the value of all of his property, according to the king's law and justice. Then only did he begin to foresee that it might fare with the magistrates, now as it had done formerly. But all women, like pomp and show, thought he and Bull was in this respect no different to other people. And she was no daughter of his either, if she couldn't keep the upper hand of her husband. So he bought her gold and jewels and other costly things. One day he came with a bracelet, and another day with a chain, and now it was a belt, and now a gold-embroidered shoe. And every time he told her that he brought her these gifts because she was his dearest jewel. He knew of nothing in the world that was too precious for her. Then, in his most pleasant and most courtly style, he just hinted that she might see to it and talk her husband over to other ways. But it booted him even less than before, and so things went on till autumn. The king's law was first, and his will was only second. Then he began to dread what would be the end of it all. His eyes sparkled so fiercely that none dare come near him. But at night he would pace up and down and shriek and bellow at his daughter and give her all sorts of vile names. Now one day he came into Bull with a heavy gold crown full of most precious stones. She should be the queen of Finnmark and Spitzbergen, said he, if her husband would do according to his will. Then she looked him stiffly in the face and said she would never seduce her husband into breaking the king's laws. He grew as pale as the wall behind him and cast the gold crown on the floor so that there was a perfect shower of precious stones about them. She must know, said he, that her father and none other was king here, and now the young officer should find out how it fared with them who sat in his seat. Then Bull washed his hands of her father altogether, but she advised her husband to depart forthwith. And on the third day she'd packed up all her bridal finery and departed in the vessel with the young officer. Then Barden smote his head against the wall, and that night he laughed so that it was heard far away. But he wept for his daughter. And now there arose such a storm that the sea was white for a whole week. And it was not long before tidings came that the ship that Bull and her husband had sailed by had gone down, and the splinters lay and floated among the skerries. Then Barden took the rudder he had got from the Wind Gnome and stuck it into the stern of the largest yacht he had. He was God himself now, said he, and could always get a fair wind to steer by, and could rule where he would in the wide world. And southwards he sailed with a rattling breeze, and the billows rolled after him like mounds and hillocks. Heavier and heavier grew the sea, till it rolled like white mountains as high as the rock walls of Lufton. It couldn't well be less when he was to rule the whole world, cried he, and so he set his rudder dead southwards. He never diminished his sail one bit, and worse grew the storm, and higher rose the sea, for now he was steering right into the sun. And I'm sure that's not the ending you expect, but I promise you, if you sit on it, it's actually a very cool ending. GS says, first time I've heard the origin to honeymoon. I don't know if it is, but it is interesting to me that honey would be a decadent food between two lovers under a moon. So maybe. Holly's House also said, jealous of your soda stream. My canisters are out. Those canisters can cost a penny for sure. This is doesn't have any carbonation. Otherwise, this would be a very gross reading. This is just pure water. That was the story of the Wind Gnome. And that is our last story for the night. Got myself a little distracted there. I enjoyed that story. I don't know that I liked it as much as the Gan Finn one, but it's up there. I feel like he does an excellent job at developing a character and staying consistent. I'm envious at how quick he does it, too. From the first sentence of that story, if the writer in me can babble for a moment, he establishes this prideful and powerful man, you know, a person who is deeply flawed by his pride. And that stays consistent throughout. It gets him success, but then it starts to become his ruin. Like, obviously, it doesn't matter that he would lose a tenth of his things. He owns the Northern Sea. But because he could, he must. You know, that sort of domineering spirit is because I can, I must. Because I could take more power, I will. Right? Even to the ruin of his own daughter, who, you know, obviously was distressing to him. And then I think there are maybe a few ways to look at that ending. I gave people a little bit of a window of time to think about it there. The first is the most obvious one to me, which is it's a reference to Icarus flying into the sun on hubris, right, to his own ruin. Oh, cool. Holly's House found it. The term honeymoon comes from the pagan culture, which these are pagan stories. The honey being a type of mead. Mead is honey wine. Drunk during seasonal festivals, including moon phases. Weddings took place in summer, and late summer was honeymoon when this mead was usually made. That's very cool. I've had mead before. It's okay. I think I like it more than grape wine, but I don't really like grape wine. Right, so I think Icarus is the obvious metaphor that you could pull from that flying into the sun. It might also, I suggest, be a thing to do with sailing that I'm not picking up on a subtlety of. It could be both those things, because it's very metaphorical in the end. But I do feel this is my interpretation of that ending. That he is at war with himself by the end of this, and therefore he kills himself at sea with his own storm, because obviously he didn't want to kill his daughter, but he didn't want to submit to this man, and that makes him a man at odds with himself. And I do feel like maybe the sun is just the light of death. I don't know if that's true. I'm just interpreting. Holly says, is it wine? I thought it was more like beer. It's definitely more like wine. It does have a fizz to it. That's true. But it's not even close to the kind of fizz you get from even old style beers. It's a very minor fizz. And it's mostly it's sweet, but it's sweet in the way like rum is sweet. Like, it's not like you eat it and it tastes like candy, but you can feel that sugar to it. It's worth trying, I think, at least once. It's cool, you know. You feel like, especially if you have Nordic Viking roots, as I do, you feel like a bit of a history there. Drinking what your people drank. I exaggerate. We were all basically farmers and loggers. Hunters. Holly's also said happy Walt Whitman's birthday. I was not aware it was his birthday, but, well, I mean, he's dead, but if you don't know Walt Whitman is, well, you probably do because he's referenced a lot in Breaking Bad. Walter White makes reference to him because they have the same initials and whatever else. But Walt Whitman is a poet. Of substantial skill, I should add. Okay. Well, to all those who came by, I hope you enjoyed the stories. I certainly had fun reading these. We've been reading from Weird Tales from the Northern Seas. I have a few more stories I want to read from it, so we'll probably do that next week. And we also have a show on Thursdays nights at 6:30 where we do live writing called The Varietal Show. Yeah, you can check that out if you want. Beyond that, please remember to like. It's just a little thumbs up. Helps me a lot. And share with a friend if you think they would like the stories as well, because I like to keep these stories circulating around. And yeah, I will keep the fire warm for you. Hope you get a good sleep. And take care of yourself. I've been Rory. You have a good night.